I call the honourable member Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. This is an incredibly serious matter that we're dealing with now in this House, and it strikes to the heart of our democracy. If we're to have freedom in New Zealand, if we're going to have a democracy, if those things mean anything, the people whose names are inscribed on the walls of these chambers, if they fought for anything, they fought for freedom and democracy. And freedom and democracy relies on a free press. But we now have the situation where the Prime Minister's office is menacing anybody who dares to disagree with the Prime Minister and forcing them to release information. We have the situation where the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister's office was leaning on Parliamentary service in order to get them to release information about members of Parliament and about the actions, about the phone records of New Zealand journalists. It is an extraordinary turn of events where the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff is in phone contact with Parliamentary service, is sending emails to Parliamentary service, telling them to release the parliamentary emails of Peter Dunn, and for all we know, and we haven't managed to get to the bottom of it yet, having something to do with the phone records around New Zealand journalist Andrea Vance, and certainly around the building movement records of that journalist. So we are now in the situation where the head of the executive, the Prime Minister's office, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, the Prime Minister's closest staff member in the entire government, there is no closer staff member to the Prime Minister than the Chief of Staff. That Chief of Staff is in contact with Parliamentary services in order to pressure them to release the email logs of a Member of Parliament. Now let's remember, those email logs were parliamentary email logs, not ministerial email logs. Let's remember that Peter Dunn, the subject of this, never gave consent for his email logs to be handed over from Parliamentary service to John Key's office. So that is the situation we now find ourselves in, where the Chief of Staff, John Key's closest ally, Wayne Eagleson, the closest member in the government to the Prime Minister, pressured Parliamentary services to hand over the private parliamentary email logs of Peter Dunn, and Parliamentary services did it. So that is the situation. Who now is safe from the Prime Minister's office? Who now can protect their records from the prying eyes of the Prime Minister, the bullying, menacing Prime Minister, who will come down like a ton of bricks on anyone who dares disagree with him? The Human Rights Commission, oh well, they're going to have their funding cut because they dared to disagree with the Prime Minister about the GCSB Act. We now have a menacing, frightening Prime Minister who is determined that the only way he can win this next election is to crush all opposition, to make sure that all journalists know that if they don't do what John Key likes, then he might pull their phone records, just like they did to John Stevenson in Afghanistan, just like they did to Andrea Vance here. He will pull their movement records to find out who they're talking to, and if there's a Member of Parliament that John Key doesn't like, then John Key will get their email logs to find out who they've been emailing. It is a matter of fact that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff lent on Parliamentary service to obtain Peter Dunn's parliamentary email logs. What kind of freedom, what kind of democracy do we have now when it is the Prime Minister's office that is engaged in this kind of menacing behaviour, menacing anyone who disagrees? It ties into a persistent theme from this Prime Minister of menacing anyone who disagrees with him, removing the democratic rights from the people of Canterbury, removing people's right to go to court to get a judicial review of the government's legislative agenda. It is a persistent attitude which says, I'm the Prime Minister, I get to decide, the rules and regulations don't matter, and Parliamentary service must hand over Members of Parliament's email log. Parliamentary service must tell us where journalists have been moving about in the building. And when it's all revealed, the Prime Minister says, oh, nothing to do with me, I had nothing to do with it. Of course, his Chief of Staff was leaning on parliamentary services to release the information. But John Key says, oh, I knew nothing about it, nothing to do with me. We ask him in the House, well, was he aware of it? Oh, well, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. It all goes back to the Prime Minister.
Mr Chairman.
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.